At the outset, let me thank Torah in Motion for the opportunity to share some Divrei Torah in honor of Pesach and Bishus, my parents who are on the call, so it's wonderful to see them. This Seder, this Shir is also sponsored, so at the outset, let me thank our sponsors. And the Shir is being sponsored by Esther Koenig in memory of her mother, Malka Krausman, Malka Bat Moshe Yitzchak, and Tema Miral, Zichronam Livracha. May we be blessed with good health and long life, and the family have long life as well. So that thank you to our sponsors, and any Shir in Torah Motion can be sponsored, and just have to reach out to the office or through the website to do so. Okay, let's begin. Why is this the title of the shir today is why is the Seder night different from all other Seder nights, which is really generic, but the real title of the shir is The Sages of Bnei Brak and Their Timeless Message of Hope. And at the outset, I think it's a foregone conclusion. I don't think it needs to be said, but between last year and this year, certainly our hearts throughout Pesach have been on Israel and on the well-being of the hostages and the plight of Israel, the challenges of Israel, and at the same time acknowledging and recognizing the extraordinary divine providence that keeps Israel alive and the miracles that have ensured its survival throughout the years. Pesach is called Leil Shimurim, a night of watching, a night of protection. And the phrase, Shomer Yisrael, the guardian of Israel, neither sleeps nor slumbers, is certainly relevant and expressed daily in communities throughout Israel and throughout the world. And so our hearts and our prayers continue to be for the safety and well-being of all in Israel. That having been said, and we'll come back to Israel very momentarily, I want to jump into our source page today. So I'm going to share my screen. You should all be on my left side. I'll have a second screen. So if you don't mind keeping your cameras on, I get to see you all through the shir. I can see all the boxes. It's all good. So that's very helpful. One of the most dramatic statements at the Seder is "V'hi shamda la'avotenu lanu v'lanu shelo achad bovad amad aleinu lachalotenu ela shebachol davador umdim aleinu lachalotenu v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu mi'adam." The recognition that there are those in every generation that arise to seek to destroy us, and God saves us from their hands. And in that context, Pesach and the story of Pesach and the story of our redemption from Egypt is not a story just of the past, but relevant to every generation. And that essentially is the core of our presentation today. That's our punchline. So if you need to sign off, you have the summary punchline of the shir right there. But I want to focus specifically on the story in Bnei Brak. It's one of those stories that appears at the beginning of the Seder that seems to be, let's say, out of place, or at least somewhat obscure or redundant. The Haggadah begins, the Magid part of the Haggadah begins, of course, with Avadim Ayinu, and the description of the slavery in Egypt, and the recognition that even our greatest sages are obligated tonight in the story of Pesach to tell the story, Hamarbel Saper B'Yetziat Mitzrayim Harezeh Mishubach, that even the greatest sages of our people, mitzvah alenu l'saper b'yetziat Mitzrayim. There's a mitzvah to tell the story. It's one of the mitzvot of the night. There's a mitzvah of Haggadah, of telling and experiencing the story of the Exodus. There's a mitzvah of Matzah. There's a mitzvah of Mor. There's a mitzvah of the Korban Pesach, which of course we can't fulfill because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash. But those are the core mitzvot of the night. And then we tell a story. Maaseh b'Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Yeshua v'Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah v'Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbi Tarfon shayim mesumim b'Bnei Brak. Story of five sages: Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon. They're all sitting and having a seder together in Bnei Brak, and they were telling the story. They were telling the story all night long. Ad shabal tamidehem v'yamulahem rabbateinu higiya zman kriyat shma shel shacharit. Sages, it's time to daven Shachris. You've been telling the story all night long. And then we have this little sidebar of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who has this debate with the Chachamim as to whether or not there's a daily mitzvah of referencing Yetziat Mitzrayim every day of the year. So, or a day, or by day or by night. I'm going to leave the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah for now, but this story of the Chachamim in Bnei Brak is really, it kind of stands out as a little vignette. It's a cute little story. And certainly it unpacks for us, as a kind of case study, two principles of the paragraph of Avadim Hayinu. Number one, that Kulanu Chachamim, even if the greatest sages of our people, even if we know the story, we have to retell the story. Okay, so here we have an example of 5 sages who knew the story, and yet they were telling the story. And the second is Kolamar Bilisaper, the more you tell, the more important, the better it is, the more praiseworthy it is, the more admirable it is. And here you see they were engaged in doing so all night long. So from that perspective, these two paragraphs are connected. On the other hand, we don't have a story about Masarav, about all the sages doing every piece of the Seder as we go through. Why here suddenly are we, at the very outset of Magid, focused on these 5 sages? And there's a host of questions on this paragraph that have been asked traditionally throughout the centuries. For example, why was it important to emphasize that they were telling the story until the morning, until Zman Kriyat Shema? Why did the students come to tell them? Why? What is the connection to the next piece of the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who's talking about a different mitzvah altogether, which is the mitzvah to mention Yetziat Mitzrayim throughout the year? But I think the biggest question of all, which is the one that the Rishonim pick up, the Barbanel certainly talks about it, is the fact that there's an inherent contradiction in this passage. There's a halachic problem in this passage. The mitzvah is Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim, to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. The mitzvah is not the Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah subject of mentioning Kriyat Shema, mentioning Yetziat Mitzrayim every night. The mitzvah is specifically the Pesach night mitzvah. That's what's under discussion. And the Haggadah, we say, later in the Haggadah, that there is a time frame for this mitzvah of Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim. The time frame is specifically when there's a relevancy to the mitzvah of matzah and maror. Meaning, the Haggadah starts, maybe I should be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim, of telling the story, all the way from Rosh Chodesh. Meaning, the whole month of Nisan, I should be able to fulfill that mitzvah. No, says the Haggadah, but avur zeh asa Hashem li. God did this because of this, God took us out of Egypt. What is this? This is referring to the mitzvah of matzah, Pesach, matzah, and maror. At the time that there's a relevancy to the mitzvah of matzah and maror, then you can fulfill the mitzvah of Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim. Well, if that's the case, then there's a big problem, because we all know that the Pesach had to be eaten before Chatzot. Everybody knows you have to eat the afikomen. For us is the equivalent of the Pesach for them. Right? We don't have the Pesach, so we have the afikomen instead. We're supposed to eat it before Chatzot. Chatzot is 1 o'clock in the morning. So how could they be telling the story of Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim all night long? That's the famous question. Probably the most famous of all the questions. The Abarbanel offers what is probably the simplest answer to this question without getting too complex. But we're going to kind of challenge it. Abarbanel suggests that they finished the entire Seder, and they did everything that they were supposed to do, including eating the matzah and the maror and whatever it was. But the sipur, this telling of the story, haya achar ha'achila. They finished eating, and then they told the story, continued to tell the story. Ad shalam with a shachar, until morning, until the students came. They were so isolated in their story, they were so engaged in their telling, uva masau matan, shaya be'enehem, shegam be'or haboker lo yumagishim. They were so telling and so engaged in the meaning of what they were talking about, they didn't even notice that the morning had come until the students had to come and wake them up for minyan, for shachos. That's the story. That's the Abarbanel, and that's sort of the classic answer to this question, that they must have fulfilled the mitzvah of matzah more first and then continued to tell the story. So if I go back to this passage, what the Abarbanel is really saying is, I have to separate the mitzvah of Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is to tell the story in the halachic context of the telling of the story, when you have, right, when the time frame is appropriate, have to separate that from the value of kol hamar b'hareza meshubach. The more the better. The more the better is even if there's no mitzvah l'saper, because the mitzvah is only until chatzot, because then the obligation is over. But the telling of the story has a value even beyond that, all the way to the morning. That's essentially what the Abarbanel is suggesting. But again, I come back to the connection between these two paragraphs. The whole purpose of the concluding sentence is Kol hamabel l'saper b'yetziat Mitzrayim. We're talking about the mitzvah of Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim, mitzvah aleinu l'saper. And so to suggest that the sages of Bnei Brak were engaged in something which was not obligated, but just praiseworthy, when in fact the language of this text says it was obligated, is challenging. So I'm looking for a different context to answer this question of how is it that they were engaged in this mitzvah all the way to the morning. If we start to unpack the story of the sages of Bnei Brak, we find something very interesting. And I want to highlight for a moment who's involved. Who is sitting there at this Seder in Bnei Brak that we're talking about? Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon. Now we're going to encounter some of these names as the Seder continues. So Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel, who's not here at the Seder, but he's mentioned later, but these are sages of all of one generation that have various roles in the Seder. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva are famously debating in the Gemara, have a debate about the language of the Baracha for Magid. We'll see that hopefully at the end of the shir today. So they're certainly later in the story. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is the next part of the story. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, in many ways, are the two most prolific names in the story of the nature, the mitzvot of the night. They have numerous debates throughout the Talmud over relevancies and aspects of this night. So it's not just an arbitrary 5 sages got together for a Seder in Bnei Brak, but these are sages that have a role to play in the unpacking of the Seder itself and the various halachic positions of the Seder. So, for example, let's start from this Gemara in Psachim, source 4. Gemara in Psachim is a very interesting debate, which is, until what time of the night is the mitzvah to eat the Korban Pesach? Okay, let's park everything we said before about the telling of the story. We'll come back to it. And now we're going to focus here on this Gemara in Psachim that says that v'yachlu et habasar b'layla hazeh, there's a mitzvah to eat the meat of the Korban Pesach that night. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, the word Laila here is also connected to the word Laila by the plagues of Egypt. Avarti be'eretz Mitzrayim b'layla hazeh, plague of the firstborn, I will pass through the land of Egypt this night. But there specifically, the plague of the firstborn took place at midnight, at Chatzot, or midnight, right? Midnight is not 12 a.m., midnight is the middle of the night, sunset to sunrise. But that notion of Chatzot, that's exactly when the plague of the firstborn took place. And therefore, says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the Korban Pesach can only be eaten until Chatzot. That's the limitation, that's famously the limitation on when we can eat the Afikom. Amala Rabbi Akiva. So again, here's Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and here's Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, wait a second. It says chipazon, that the nature of the Korban Pesach was eaten in haste. What does haste mean? Ad shat chipazon, until the time of haste. So we'll unpack, we'll talk about what the time of haste is in a second. It's a Gemara in Brachos. But therefore, says Rabbi Akiva, Ma Talmud Lamar Balayla. Balayla means it can't be eaten by day. it has a limitation of it can't be eaten the next morning, but it can be eaten all night long. Why all night long? Because he will define the word, the haste of chipazon is referring to something that took place by day, not something that took place at night. What are we referring? Referring specifically to another debate that appears in a Gemara, parallel Gemara in Brachot. It says the following. Gemara lists a number of mitzvot that have a time frame, and the time frame is nighttime. The question becomes whether the time frame is nighttime until chatzot or nighttime until the morning. So Kriyat Shema and Ma'ariv and Hallel of Pesach night and eating of the Korban Pesach, says the Braita, is mitzvah ad she'aleh amud hashachar, can be done all night long till the morning. Amar Rav Yosef Lokasha, Rav Yosef says, but we just said it can only be eaten to chatzot. To which Rav Yosef answers, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva. You're talking about two different perspectives, two different halachic views. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is of the opinion that the Korban Pesach can only be eaten until chatzot. Rabbi Akiva was of the opinion that it could be eaten all night long. Here is zeroing in on the issue. Amar Rabbi Abba. Everybody agrees, says Rabbi Abba, that when they were redeemed from Egypt, they were redeemed at night, Chatzot Laila, because that was the moment of Makat B'chorot, as it says, Laila. When they left Egypt by day. Kishi Yatsu Lo Yatsu Ela Bayom. As it says, after the Pesach they went and they left Biyad Ramah with a high hand in the middle of the day. What's the debate between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah savar my chipazon de Mitzrayim, but Rabbi Akiva savar my chipazon de Yisrael. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says the haste of which we are talking is the haste of Egypt. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that the haste which we are talking about is the haste of Israel. What's going on? So let's go a little bit further and take a look at the source of this discussion. The pasuk in Shmot says that when they eat the Korban Pesach at the Seder in the middle of the night in their homes, kacha tochlu oto, they had to eat it in the following fashion: motnechem chagurim na'alechem beraglechem makalchem biyadchem, their loins girded, the sandals on their feet, staff in hand. They had to eat it as if they were ready to leave Egypt at a moment's notice. Va'achaltem oto b'chipazon, and eat it in haste. Pesach hu la'Hashem. Which Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, what is the chipazon here? Says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the chipazon is the chipazon of Egypt. What does that mean? Rashi explains the chipazon of Egypt is Makat HaBechorim, was the plague of the firstborn. God going through Egypt in the middle of the night, smiting the firstborn, created a crisis for Egypt. And because of that crisis, they came to Bnei Yisrael and they said, leave now. Shal yadam nechbezu lemeher l'shalcham. They came and they tried to push them out. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says, no, it's chipazon de Yisrael. What does chipazon de Yisrael mean? Lo shamu lehem letzet ad boker. Egypt came and asked us to leave in the middle of the night, but we didn't do so. We refused to leave until the next morning. And that's exactly what we find in source 8. We find the verses, Vatechazak Mitzrayim al ha'am. Thank you. You too. Vatechazak Mitzrayim al ha'am l'mehel shalcha min haaretz. Egypt came rushing after them, running to them, telling them, leave, leave, leave in the middle of the night. We're all going to die. But the pasuk is very clear. We left in the middle of the day. We didn't leave at night. And so the real question is, when the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach, we'll come back to Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach, the mitzvah of Matzah, the mitzvah of Marah, the experience of the Seder, what is this time frame of Chipazon? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says it all revolves around that moment of Chatzot Laila. Why? Because that was the moment God smote the Egyptians. If you want to know when we were redeemed, when were we finally free of the burden of Egypt? When Egypt came running to us and said to us, leave because God smote the Egyptians, that moment of the plague of the firstborn, everything revolves around that moment. Sha'at chipazon de Mitzrayim. Rabbi Akiva says, no, nothing happened until we left the next morning. In other words, what's debated here between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah isn't just a time frame. It's a worldview on what the concept of redemption was. What is Pesach celebrating? Is it celebrating the miracle of the plague of the firstborn? Is it celebrating the plagues on Egypt? Is it celebrating God's miraculous intervention on our behalf? That culminates at midnight. Or is it celebrating the fact that we stood up, took a stand, walked out of Egypt with our heads held high biyad ramah? That didn't happen until the morning. And that's really the debate. The debate is the nature of redemption. To Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, redemption is God's intervention, is miraculous, it's the nes, it's makat bechorot. To Rabbi Akiva, we have to have a hand in that redemption. We have to have a role to play. If we had stayed in Egypt, if we had decided not to leave, if we hadn't followed Moshe and followed God into the desert, this would have all been for naught. The celebration of Pesach is because we left be'etzem hayom hazeh. There are completely two different perspectives on what redemption represents and what we're celebrating this night. And we understand that if Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is correct, and the mitzvot are only till midnight, then the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzit Mitzrayim that they were engaged in telling all night long is also only until midnight. But if Rabbi Akiva is correct, that the mitzvah is you can eat the Korban Pesach all night long, because what we're really celebrating is the fact that that night we prepared ourselves to leave and to follow God and to follow Moshe into the desert. Zacharti la chesed ne'orayach, says Yirmiyahu, I remember the love of your youth. You followed me into the wilderness. That's the core of the moment. That's what we're celebrating. We left biyad ramah. Then all through the night we can eat the Korban Pesach, and all through the night we can tell the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzit Mitzrayim because they're connected. So the question I asked at the beginning really depends on whether you paskin like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah or you paskin like Rabbi Akiva. But the debate is even deeper than that. It's not just a debate about when we were redeemed and whether or not we were redeemed when God smote the Egyptians or whether we were redeemed when we walked out of Egypt. The debate is really about the very nature of what redemption is all about. To Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the model, the paradigm, the greatest example of redemption is the plague of the firstborn, which on various occasions in history has repeated itself. Yeshayahu talks about that moment when the armies of Sennacherib laid siege to Yerushalayim, and God said to them, "Don't worry, I will destroy the army of Sennacherib at the siege of Yerushalayim." And Yeshayahu says to the people, "Go, my people, hide in your rooms. Close the doors behind you. Hide for a moment. Ad yavor zam, till the indignation, till the evil passes by." That's makat bechorot, because makat bechorot, we were in our homes, we couldn't leave. Atem lo tetzu ish mipetach beito ad boker. We weren't allowed to walk out of our doors. This was entirely God's hand in the story of the plague of the firstborn. This was redemption by God's hand. And that's what happened in this famous story of Sancherib. The Malach went and smote the Assyrian army. But to Rabbi Akiva, if we're commemorating, celebrating, and recognizing that the redemption is not about God's miraculous smiting of the Egyptians, it's about the partnership. God enables us to follow him into the desert. If that's the model of redemption, that's a very different paradigm. And that's a paradigm that in the course of history repeats itself. We have to have a role to play in redemption as it unfolds. Hence, the Yerushalmi famously talks about the sages who saw the sun rising at a morning's dawn and said, "That's the nature of redemption. It's like the morning dawn." It starts very slowly. It starts very naturally. It's a different paradigm in what redemption is. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's paradigm is that it's miraculous. It's the Makat Bechorot. It's the middle of the night. Rabbi Akiva's paradigm, it's a partnership between God and man, and without that role of leaving Egypt, choosing to leave Egypt b'yad ramah in the middle of the day, there could have been no redemption. So if I break down the machloket to which we start, this little story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva and their friends dining in Bnei Brak, right? At the core of the question, why can they be telling the story all night long, is the question, do we paskin like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah or do we paskin like Rabbi Akiva? We all know we have to eat the afikomen by chatzot. So I'll let you in on a little secret. If you don't eat it by chatzot, you can continue to eat it after chatzot, because we really paskin like Rabbi Akiva. We just machmir in order to try to fulfill both obligations. That's a sidebar. But what I really wanted to point out is, where is this Seder taking place? That's the real key. Because they all come to Maaseh, let's go back to the story. Maaseh for Rabbi Eliezer, for Rabbi Yeshua, for Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, for Rabbi Akiva, for Rabbi Tarfon, Shahayu Misubim b'Bnei Brak. It's not just that they had a Seder together. They had a Seder in Bnei Brak. So why is Bnei Brak relevant? So let's go back to where we were. Sorry for the jump around on the source page, but I'm trying to do this in order. There is a Gemara in Sanhedrin that identifies who the heads of each Beit Din were in a particular time period. The Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, Tzedek Tzedek Tirdov, Halech Achrei Chachamim Le'Yeshiva. Each sage, each Beit Din, each academy had its own head or sage, and you would follow that sage and to their academy. So in Yavne, it was Rabbi Gamliel, Achar Rabbi Gamliel Yavne. And Rabbi Yeshua was in the exile, and Rabbi was in Beit Sha'arim, and the Chachamim were in the temple in the chamber of the hewn stone in Nishkat HaGazit. Where is Rabbi Akiva's home? Achar Rabbi Akiva leBnei Brak. Bnei Brak was the home of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was the Marada'atra in Bnei Brak, which means that they weren't just dining together at a Seder. They were participating in Rabbi Akiva's Seder in Rabbi Akiva's town. And therefore, it's no question that they would paskin like Rabbi Akiva at Rabbi Akiva's Seder. So if Rabbi Akiva says you can have the Seder until the morning because all night long is the mitzvah, you can continue to tell the story all night long. And so that's what they did. They fulfilled the mitzvot of the Seder in accordance with Rabbi Akiva because that's where they were. That's a simple answer. The real question is, and this is where more or less the shir begins, why were they coming to Rabbi Akiva, and why was that important to the Haggadah? What were they doing in Bnei Brak? And why was that relevant to the Haggadah? So there are theories out there. I've heard them over the years, many of them, and I think there's a lot of basis to them. I'm going to take the shir in a different direction, but there are many who suggest that there's an allusion in this story, and that there's a hidden references to the Rabbi Akiva and the support of the Bar Kokhba revolt, and they were hiding in a cave, and therefore they couldn't know when Shachris was. The students came to tell them when Shachris was, because they were all part of this preparation for the rebellion against Rome and the Bar Kokhba revolt. That is a very prevalent theory. Even so much as, I'm uncomfortable with that piece of the story as a solution by itself, because we all know that the Bar Kokhba revolt failed. We all know that Beitar, which was the final and biggest battle of the Bar Kokhba revolt, fell, and it's part of the Tisha B'Av story. So what are we really celebrating at the Seder? Are we really telling this story so that we can commemorate all the failed work that they did to prepare for a rebellion against Rome that didn't actually succeed? That was a failure? I have a hard time with that approach. It's possible, historically, maybe. I don't have evidence to support, to suggest otherwise, but I have a problem with the idea that we're going to spend that much time at the Seder focusing on a gathering of the sages to prepare for a revolt that we know in hindsight was a failure. And the Chazal had mixed reviews on whether or not they should or should not have participated in that revolt and whether they should have joined forces with Bar Kokhba. So what I'd like to do is modify that theory slightly and suggest that this is not about the preparation for the revolt. I'm not even sure it's before the revolt. I could argue that this was after the revolt and after the fall of Beitar. It would not make any difference to my understanding of the story. Because what I really want to suggest is that they came to Rabbi Akiva, this is a generation that lived after the destruction of the temple. Whether before the revolt against Rome, like after the revolt of Bar Kokhba, they had lived through extraordinarily difficult times. They were living through extraordinarily difficult times. Many of these sages were murdered by the Romans in the Hadrianic persecutions that we talk about in the Asar HaRukei Malchus. They were living in extraordinarily difficult times. But they came to Rabbi Akiva. And they came to Rabbi Akiva because everybody knew that if you wanted to look at a worldview that could look at the world and see patterns of history, godliness, events taking place that have real meaning that we can participate in, and that whether we succeed or we don't succeed, the paradigm of hope and the paradigm of strength to navigate through all of this and through the entire tumultuous period that they were living in, there's none like Rabbi Akiva to bring them that hope. And so I'm convinced that they came to Rabbi Akiva intentionally. That's why the story says they were in Bnei Brak. It's not arbitrary. They were in Bnei Brak. Because whatever crisis was going on, at a time of crisis, they turned to Rabbi Akiva. We all know the story about the Gemara where they were walking through the Har Bayit and they saw a fox. We'll come back to that Gemara at the end of the story, at the end of the shir. There was none like Rabbi Akiva who could bring them hope and expectation and anticipation. But the reason he could do so was because Rabbi Akiva had a unique perspective on how to read history. And that's what I want to pick up on. We say in the Haggadah, every person has to look at themselves as if they left Egypt. As it says, this was done for me. What does that mean? That every generation, we have to see ourselves as if we left Egypt. As if, says the Haggadah, Lord Avatenu Bilvad, God didn't redeem just our forefathers, but we also were redeemed. We were also brought out of Egypt. And we were also brought to the land of Israel. This is our story. This is our history. That's one way to look at it. But there's a different way to look at it, which I think was part of Rabbi Akiva's worldview. Rav Kook writes about that passage of V'chol dor v'dor, in every generation a person is obligated to see themselves as if they left Egypt, that's not just about seeing the story of Jewish history, it's about feeling that we participate in Jewish history. Rav Kook writes that it's the power of each generation. Chayav kol adam lahashlim, lahasig, ulargish et chelko b'shlemut hamaleh. Each person has to feel their role, their contribution, their chelek. They have to feel the relevance of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the values of the story, the brit with God, God's protection, God's involvement, our partnership with God, the values, the concept, the paradigm of redemption has to be then translated to Hashayach le'erko u'ledorot, to the values of their generation. They have to take that potential and then translate it into real terms. So in Rabbi Akiva's terms, whether it meant the source of hope in the prophets of of redemption that in the story of the fox we'll come to at the end of this year, or whether it meant you needed to support Bar Kokhba because he was trying to take the Jewish people in a new direction and elevate their state of being, because that's part of the mandate of seeing Yetziat Mitzrayim not as an event of the past, but as a paradigm that a partner with God in the redemption of Israel in every generation. La shayach le'erko u'ledoro. The Nevi'im did this all the time. The Nevi'im, whenever they spoke about great events that were taking place or that would take place, they couched it in paradigms and language that was taken from the story of the Exodus. Yeshayahu talks about kibbutz goliot, the gathering of the exiles. He talks about splitting the sea and let the Jewish people come through. Nahar hinif yado ala nahar ba'ayam rucho v'hikau l'shiva nachalim, splitting the sea into 7 streams so that it will create a road for the people to travel through and come back from Ashur. He even uses language taken from Shirat Hayam to describe the Hallel and Thanksgiving that we will say on that day. Or Devorah when she talks about the victory against Gidon, victory with Barak against Sisera. And she talks about the great victory against with the rain in the middle of the summer that drowned that trapped the chariots of Sisera's army. She describes it as if God's appearance at Mamad HaSinai was repeating itself. Harim nazlu mipnei Hashem, the mountains quaked and flowed because of the rain. Ze Sinai mipnei Hashem Elokai Yisrael. She calls it Sinai. David HaMelech in Shirat Hayam does the same thing, and we read this Shir on Shvi Shel Pesach. He's talking about being saved from his enemies and his challenges at his moment, and he uses language that is drawn directly from Kriyat Yamsuf. This was the notion that we saw Yetziat Mitzrayim not as an event of the past, but as a relevant mandate, paradigm for how we navigate through history, was part of the story of what Rabbi Akiva represented. For example, the Rambam draws a very powerful conclusion from Rabbi Akiva. He says, Al yalel al da'atach shehamelech hamashiach tzurich lasot otot umuftim. Don't think, when it comes to the redemption of our people, the paradigm of messianic redemption, that the Mashiach has to do wonders and miracles. Not true. Not so. He doesn't have to resurrect the dead, and he doesn't have to do wondrous miracles. He's a king. He's a leader. And these kinds of things that are said by fools. It's not so. Rabbi Akiva was one of the greatest sages of the Mishnah. And he was the supporter of Bar Kokhba. And he said of Bar Kokhba that he was Melech HaMashiach. He wasn't alone. There were many who followed Rabbi Akiva's approach. Now listen carefully to what he says. Till Bar Kokhba died. When Bar Kokhba died, they knew that he could no longer be Mashiach, because if there's one job description for being Mashiach, is that they have to be alive. You have to have a. And once he died, they knew that he wasn't Mashiach anymore, or that he couldn't be. And at no point did the Chachamim ever ask Bar Kokhba to do wonders and miracles or ototum uftim. The paradigm of redemption, they say, is not makat b'charot. It's not the miracles of the smiting of the firstborn. The paradigm of redemption was following Moshe and following God into the desert and doing what we needed to do in order to redeem ourselves. But there's something else about the story. The Rambam doesn't say that the reason that once Bar Kokhba died, they abandoned Rabbi Akiva's perspective on what redemption looks like. No, they just it was a failed attempt. Okay, so we'll try the next one. In other words, it wasn't Rabbi Akiva who failed, it was Bar Kochba, granted. But Rabbi Akiva was still perceived to be correct in his approach to redemption. And they came to Rabbi Akiva because they needed that. They needed to learn from Rabbi Akiva. He was the leader of that generation. It was his perspective on history that would give them hope and strength. And moving forward, that was what was critical. I'll show you something very interesting. Really an extraordinary comment. It appears in source 22 is a parish on the Agada called Afike Mayim, written by Rabbi Moshe Shapiro Zatzal. And he writes the following. You know, there's a mitzvah to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim uniquely to each one of our children. The story of the Arba Banim at the beginning of the Seder. Often הסיפור לבנים הוא בדרך שחל התורה יציאת מצרים מן הצרה והגלות של עכשיו. The Torah, how we tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is couched in the language of the immediate challenges of our generation, of the exile of today. Halal ne'emar al-gula d'shecha gam hashta. Halal is said over redemption, not just of the past. It's the difference between Halal HaMitzri and Halal HaGadol. Halal HaMitzri, which we say is part of Magid, was said over Halal of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. But Halal HaGadol that we say at the end of the Seder is over the future, is over the redemption. Similarly, the redemption from our tzarot that we have today is part of the story. And he says the following, Umiatan nira perush divrei bal haggadah. B'chol davado chayav adam lirot et atzmo. In every generation, a person has to see themselves as if they left Egypt. Meaning, Ikar hadin shel b'chol davado ne'emar al hadin lirot sheyetziat Mitzrayim nogea lanu b'chol hadarot. The primary message of the phrase b'chol davado is to see that it's relevant to us, that we have to see the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim as a story of God looking after us in our current challenges and circumstances and guiding us and helping us and partnering with us. But then he writes, in the Haggadah, the next, we also say, the phrase "b'chol dovador" in every generation appears twice. It appears in every generation a person has to see themselves as if they left Egypt. And again, in every generation, they tried to destroy us, and there are new enemies, and there are new challenges. Once it was Mitzrayim, then it was Bavel, then it was Paras, then it was Yavan, then it was Rome, then it was Christianity, then it was Islam, and today, right, use your imagination. Tried to destroy us in every generation. Anti-Semitism around the world hasn't seen this level of expression in decades. Says Moshe Shapiro, the keneged ma shebechol dor vador omdim aleinu lechalotenu tzrichim anu lehotzia lapoel koach hayetzia gam bechol dor vador. These two statements of bechol dor vador are interconnected. In the same way we see that there are enemies in every generation who try to destroy us, we also have to see the relevance of the process of Yetziat Mitzrayim and the partnership that Yetziat Mitzrayim represented in how we address those challenges. This isn't about history of the past. This is about recognizing what we can do, says Rabbi Akiva, to partner with God to bring us out of these challenges and to see redemption as a relevant value in today's world. That's what they came to Rabbi Akiva to hear. An extraordinary observation. There are two Bechol Davados. They're connected to each other. As much as we have challenges in every generation, we have redemption and miracles and God's protection and Leil Shimurim and Nisim V'Niflos, and none greater than the creation of the state of Israel itself in every generation. And we have an obligation to see the relevance and the mechanisms and the tools of Yetziat Mitzrayim in our generation.
אותנו תוציא משם.
Say that again. I didn't hear the question.
Otanu is the key word.
Yeah, we were. You see this very interestingly. Again, it all comes back to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Here's another debate between Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues sitting there in Bnei Brak. How do we end the bracha of Magid? So here's the bracha of Magid as it appears in the Haggadah. I've separated it into two paragraphs because I've cheated. If I had left it as one paragraph, you'd understand the question better. But the bracha starts as follows: Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher ga'alanu v'ga'alat avotenu mitzrayim. God who redeemed us and redeemed our ancestors from Egypt, and who brought us this night to eat matzah and mar. Ken Hashem Elokeinu v'kei avotenu yagienu lemoadim v'leregalim acharim. So too should God bring us to other seasons and festivals that are coming to greet us likratenu l'shalom. We should be rejoice in the rebuilding of your city and dance and happy at your service, to be your servants. And there in the Beit HaMikdash we should be able to eat of the Zevach and the Pesach. So that we can thank you with a new song over our redemption and the redemption of our people in our lives in our generation. Baruch atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael. Now, if you look carefully at this bracha, it sounds like there are two brachos here. There's the bracha of Ga'alanu v'ga'alat avotenu. He redeemed us and redeemed our forefathers. Magid is about how we left Egypt. This is the bracha of Magid. And it has to include an explanation of matzah and maror. Fine. So in the bracha, we talk about Ga'alanu v'ga'alat avotenu and Higiyanu alayla zeh l'chol b'matzah and maror. We've got all the pieces of the puzzle right there. That could be the end of the bracha. But there's a second paragraph here that says, no, we have to look to the future and see the relevance of Magid for the future. And talk about redemption of the future as well. And that's part of Magid. And that's not just part of Halal that will come after the meal. That's part of Magid now. It's the bracha of Magid. Where does this double paragraph come from? The answer is very simple. It's a debate between two versions of the bracha. One authored by, guess who? Rabbi Akiva. No surprise which half was authored by Rabbi Akiva, right? It's Gemara in Pesachim. The Gemara says at the end of Magid, Chotem beGeula, you have to recite a bracha that talks about redemption. What's that bracha? What is the language? Rabbi Tarfon Omer. Rabbi Tarfon said, Rabbi Tarfon was one of the sages in Bnei Brak. Remember, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon. Asher ga'alanu v'ga'alat avotenu in Mitzrayim, he redeemed us and our forefathers from Egypt. V'lo haya chotem. And that, it didn't have a conclusion. It was one short bracha. One paragraph. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher ga'alanu v'ga'alat avotenu mimitzrayim v'giyanu alayla zeh l'chol b'matzah u'mar. Period. Amen. That's the bracha. Rabbi Akiva Omer, no. It has to include a relevance to today and tomorrow. Kain Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu yagienu l'moadim v'legalim achim v'ba'im v'kotenu l'shalom smechim, etc., etc., etc. Ad Baruch atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael. It's a completely different paradigm. So in the Haggadah, we do both. But we have to recognize the imprimatur of Rabbi Akiva and his fingerprints over every part of the Seder. When we say Hallel, Hodu l'Hashem ki tov ki li'olam chazdo, Yomru gu'ulei Hashem asher galam miyad tsar, those who redeemed from distress in every generation, me'artzot kibtzar me'mizrach u'me'marav mitzafon u'meyam, and who gathered the exiles from every generation from all corners of the earth, from north, south, east, and west. That's what Geula is. That's what Rabbi Akiva represented. Rabbi Sachs writes this up very powerfully, very succinctly in his Haggadah, when he talks about this bracha. And he writes, the blessing over the past and the prayer for the future was composed by two great scholars of the Mishnaic age. The first part was written by Rabbi Tarfon, the second by Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was the guardian of hope at one of the darkest times of Jewish history. Then he tells the story about Rabbi Akiva and the fox, which I'm going to skip for now. It took nearly 2,000 years, but we have seen the Rabbi Akiva's words end with a quote from the verse of Zechariah. Once again, men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets of Jerusalem, and the cities will be filled with the boys and girls playing there. It took nearly 2,000 years, but it has happened in our lifetime. It was Rabbi Akiva's hope expressed here in the vision of days that are coming to meet us in peace that sustained us in exile. And I would argue that it sustained us not because it was just a message of hope, but because it was a perspective on how to embrace the challenges of each generation, navigate them, engage in partnership with God, do something in order to help change the plight of the Jewish people and to bring them hope. It was active, it was engaged, it was Rabbi Akiva, whether it was the Bar Kochba or whether it was any other experience that Bar Kochba, that Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues had. As we bring this to a close, I'll come to this heading in a second, but I want to collect, over the course of various places throughout Shas, this perspective of Rabbi Akiva jumps off the page. And we're familiar with it, we've heard it, but I just want to show you kind of this cross-section of moments when the sages turned to Rabbi Akiva because he wasn't just a leader of his generation, he had a perspective on history that enabled him to see, okay, what's the next step we have to take despite the challenges? So, of course, the famous Gemara in Makos, Rabbi Gamliel, and who's also in the Haggadah, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who's in the Haggadah, and Rabbi Yeshua, who's in the Haggadah, and Rabbi Akiva, right? So they're all the same, all the sages of the Haggadah. They were all walking around in Yerushalayim after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, after the destruction, and they saw this fox emerge from the Kodesh HaKadoshim. What's fascinating to me about the story is the sages who were there. They're the same sages that came to Rabbi Akiva in Bnei Brak. Gamliel wasn't there, but other than that, this is how they saw Rabbi Akiva's message to them. And they start to cry, and Rabbi Akiva starts to laugh, and they asked him why, and they said, because it's the fulfillment of a prophecy of destruction, but that means that I will also guarantee the prophecy of redemption. And they said to him, Akiva nichamtanu, you've brought us comfort. Because it's a perspective that enables them to regroup themselves and to move forward. It's Gemara in Yevamos, very famous. We're about to enter into the period of Sfirat HaOmer. Everybody knows Sfirat HaOmer was originally a very joyous time, and in our time, we are mourning during the period of the Omer. Why are we mourning during the Omer? Because of the tragedy of the death of Rabbi Akiva's students. Nobody knew more tragedy than Rabbi Akiva. There I would subscribe to the theory that they died in the Bar Kochba revolt. But nonetheless, the Gemara says that there were 12,000 pairs of Talmidim, 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva, and they all died at one period of time. And that's the mourning period that we have during the Omer. But the Gemara doesn't talk about the Omer, and it doesn't talk about the mourning period. The Gemara here is not talking about the tragedy of Rabbi Akiva's students. And we miss this when we just talk about Sfira. The Gemara is talking about Rabbi Akiva's power of rebuilding, power of hope. He says, the Gemara says, the world was desolate, 24,000 students of one Beit Midrash. Call it the fall of Bar Kochba and all the people in Beitar who died. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva, it's Rabbeinu shebadarom, ushna aleh. So Rabbi Akiva went south. He took 5 students, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua, and he retaught them their entire Torah. And they rebuilt Torah. Masoret, the chain wasn't broken. Rabbi Akiva was still there. He rebuilt it from 5 new students. That's the message of the Gemara. The Gemara's message isn't about the destruction of Beitar or the fall of Bar Kochba or the tragedy of the death of the students. The Gemara's story is about Rabbi Akiva's ability to rebuild. to see the mechanism, to see, okay, so what do I have to do next? Or Rabbi Akiva after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and there's no Avod of Yom Kippur, and who says to the people, Amar Rabbi Akiva, Ashrechem Yisrael, you are happy, O you are Israel, because now you can stand before God directly in prayer, and He will purify you. That was Rabbi Akiva. When Rabbi Akiva said that we have to navigate through what Yetziat Mitzrayim was in the past to what it can be today, what it is today, it meant he had to see the events of today in biblical terms. We live in a generation in which events are taking place that are of biblical nature, character, biblical size, and repercussions. Just the miracle of the ingathering of the exiles of Kibbutz Galiot is of enormous, is greater and larger than ever in our history. There are more Jews living in Israel than ever before in the history of the people. Right? The army of Israel, the state of Israel today is probably stronger than ever was in the time of Tanakh, maybe even of David HaMelech. We have to see the perspective that we live in the generation we live in. That was Rabbi Akiva's worldview. And I want to bring this to one final comment of the Haggadah. We said before, and that was the quote from Moshe Shapiro, that there are two places in the Haggadah that talk about B'chol Dor Vador. In every generation they try to destroy us. In every generation, they try to destroy. In every generation we have to see the events of Yetziat Mitzrayim relevant to telling us and teaching us and navigating how we navigate through the circumstances. But there's one more phrase, B'chol Dor Vador, in the Haggadah. There are actually three phrases of B'chol Dor Vador. Because when we get to Hallel, in the Haggadah, what do we say? The assemblies of tens of thousands of your people, the house of Israel, we proclaim Malkeinu, B'chol Dor Vador, in every generation, that we have an obligation to sing before you and to thank you. Sheken chovat kol ha'yitzurim lahodot lahalel l'shabech, to give thanks, to give hallel, to sing to you, to thank you for the redemption, not just of the past and not just of the near past, but of the present and of the future. In every generation, we have an obligation to recognize the miracles and to sing hallel v'nodeh lecha ashir chadash al gulateinu v'abadut nafsheinu. That's the B'chol Dor Vador. The message that it isn't just moments of challenge and tragedy, but even moments of greatness. That too is Rabbi Akiva's message. Because Rabbi Akiva was the one who said that when we have to thank God, we have to thank you have to thank God whether you are in challenging times or whether you are in good times. You have to acknowledge and recognize that partnership. As David himself said in Tehillim, 2 verses back to back, Kos Yeshuot Esa B'Shem Hashem Ekra, Tzarod Miyagon Imtza B'Shem Hashem Ekra. I will call out to God at times of greatness when my cup of salvation overflows. I will call out to God in times of anguish and pain. In both cases, I will partner with God in how we navigate through life. That's Rabbi Akiva. And that's what they came to Bnei Brak to hear. Before the Bar Kochba revolt, after the Bar Kochba revolt, they came to Rabbi Akiva because Rabbi Akiva was their source of hope, comfort, who taught them how to navigate through, how to partner with God, how to see chipazon, not just of the events of the miracles of God, but of the role that Israel played in leaving Egypt with a strong hand, biyad ramah. And I'll conclude with this last quote from Rabbi Sachs, really an extraordinary observation. He writes, the deepest difference between linear and covenantal time is that whereas the first gives rise to optimism, the latter leads to hope. These two concepts, often confused, are in fact utterly different. Optimism is the belief that things will get better. Hope is the belief that together we can make things better. Optimism is a passive virtue. Hope is an active one. It takes no courage, only naivete, to be an optimist. But it takes great courage to sustain hope. No Jew knowing what we know of the past, of hatred, of bloodshed, persecution in the name of God, suppression of human rights in the name of freedom, no Jew could be an optimist. But Jews have never given up hope. That's the power of the Nevi'im, and he quotes a series of psukim. To be a prophet is to find a vestige of hope in the wreckage of despair. Jewish time is the secret of the influence of the Pesach story on the Western imagination. It is the supreme narrative of hope. That's Rabbi Akiva. That's why they come to Rabbi Akiva always, whenever there was a challenge. And Rabbi Akiva's perspective gives them comfort. Akiva nichamtanu. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who disagreed with Rabbi Akiva on his worldview. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, all who also disagreed on the bracha, all came to celebrate Pesach that year in Bnei Brak because they needed to hear Rabbi Akiva's message. We, in our generation, I believe, need to hear Rabbi Akiva's message, perhaps more than any generation in the past, because it's so relevant to our generation, both the good and the challenging. And to recognize the uniqueness of the perspective, the biblical level of engagement in partnership with God that we have in our generation today, both in the creation of the state of Israel and navigating through the challenges of Israel and the world around us. That, I believe, is Rabbi Akiva's message of hope and the story of Bnei Brak and its role in the Haggadah. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Very,
My pleasure.
It's great. You've really told us that that Rabbi Akiva is about Hatikva.
Yes, very much so.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. That was great.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you.
I wrote in the comments if the machloka between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel with respect to how much Hallel we say at Magi ties into this.
How much Hallel we say?
According to Beit Shammai, we say Halu of De Hashem, which the focus is only on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whereas Beit Hillel says B'Seit Yisrael Mitzrayim, which focuses on the human component in the Geula.
That's one. Okay, that's one way to look at it. Also, those two paragraphs together talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim up through and including Kriyat Yamsuf. There may be
Not
a
the first
chronological.
one. Not the first parak. Halu of De Hashem.
Maybe. Okay. There's much. Okay, I'd have to process that a little bit. Hallel is a unit, so I'm not sure that there's you can say Hallel in out of sequence. But maybe. Okay. I have to think about that.
Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was a Shamuti, which would put him in the same school as Beit Shammai, perhaps.
Okay. I hear you. I hear what you're saying.
Oh, sorry, not Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Eliezer.
Yes, I'd have to process. I'd have to unpack that machloket. I hadn't considered that machloket in this discussion, but I would explore it before I would make comment on it. But thank you.
Regarding the chronology, to say that the Seder of Bnei Brak took place after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, I find that very difficult. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Tarfon both lived before the Churban. If the Bar Kokhba rebellion is 135, you're making them.
They all lived at the same time. That's clear.
No, Rabbi Akiva was later. Rabbi Akiva was much younger. Rabbi Akiva lived to be 120, according to Chazal.
So I'm saying, but they all had a moment in which they could all come together, whether that was the Bar Kokhba revolt or not. Again, as I said, I don't think it matters.
I don't think Rabbi Yeshua lived during the time of the Beit HaMikdash. He was a third generation Tana.
I'd have to look that up.
Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Elazar were second generation, as far as I know.
I would have to explore that, but for now, I would take it at face value. But I'd have to look that up. I'm not sure.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Your approach to Rabbi Akiva, isn't that similar to what you said in your Yehoshua classes about the children of Israel needing to participate in the Gula and to being part of it rather than to sit back and just let the miracle come. So it's, I
Yeah,
mean, you're
yeah.
consistent, which
My
is
mind
not
goes
bad.
to my mind goes to the same place in various contexts. That's true.
Okay, and then the other question I have, which only occurred to me now after hearing the story since I was a kid, is, I mean, Rabbi Akiva was an optimist in so many ways. He rebuilt himself at 40 from an Amma Aretz sheep herder or shepherd to a scholar and a man of letters. So the same thing, he can continually rebuilds himself. But isn't it amazing that somebody who loses 24,000 students, whether it's to a war that he tells them to go to or a plague that comes, I mean, I think most people would retreat to the hills and commit suicide. And I've never heard any talk that he did any sin that caused his students. But most people would say, if all my students died, it must be something in me. What did I transmit badly or wrongly or not emphasize?
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. Rabbi Akiva's, I think that's the whole point of the Gemara in Yevamos, which is to highlight what Rabbi Akiva did next. Which the story is less about the fact that the students were destroyed as much as it was how Rabbi Akiva responded, which was to rebuild, because that's who he was.
But if we're going to go on conjecture, which we often do in Midrash, you could conjecture that the sages came to Bnei Brak because Rabbi Akiva needed the nichum of the sages to after his students died. And then the further story about Jerusalem being there is that they drew him out of his moroseness to leave Bnei Brak.
That's already too far to conjecture for my comfort zone, because the classic paradigm in all these midrashim is that Rabbi Akiva is the one who's offering that strength and comfort, not receiving it. So you're theorizing
you don't
something
have
which
to
is very
buy
interesting, but there's no evidence to that. So I would hold that thought. I think it's more likely the other way around.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. All right. Have a wonderful day. Does anybody else have a question?
No, but I do want to say that, when Yaakov says Ela, that about Menashe, about his grandsons, who are they? He doesn't mean who are they. He means what have they become? And I think whatever you're saying now, our generation, our young generation, whether in America or anywhere in the diaspora, mostly in Israel, has really come to do what Rabbi Akiva is talking about, to do together to make things better. So proud of our generation.
For sure. I think
here or in Israel.
I totally agree with you. I think that
and I could have used this at the beginning when I kept saying, "Where are you, Hashem?" and I kept davening. But I'm so proud of our generation, and I think this really speaks to it, that they followed Rabbi Akiva. It's amazing to me.
sure.
It's amazing. And keep doing.
Frida, you have a question?
Yeah, I think there are two amazing parts to what you said about Rabbi Akiva. One is whether or not his students were killed according to Chazal because they didn't respect one another, whatever that means, or whether they were killed in the Milchama. I think it's amazing. We don't know that people accepted Rabbi Akiva to continue to be the teacher, the Magid, the Menahel, that they didn't consider him a failure despite the death of all of his students. So there's the godless of Rabbi Akiva, that he found the koach to start again. But there's also something here that he was not perceived as having been mistaken, that he could still continue to teach.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know enough Gemara to know whether that comes out someplace there or in the Medrash or.
Yeah, I mean, there's that's that passage that I quoted earlier, that he found 5 students, and those 5 students are the authors of all of the components of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Mishnah, Breita, Tosefta, they are the prime authors of the Masoret of Torah Sheba'al Peh that continue from Rabbi Akiva. It's Rabbi Akiva's, and I think it stems in part from Rabbi Akiva's story, right? It stems from his own personal story that realizes that second chances are part of how we live and who we are. I agree with you. Rabbi Akiva is a very important paradigm in that regard. With this I'll close because I think the hour is late. One of the famous questions, one of the most famous expressions, quotes from Rabbi Akiva is Amar Rabbi Akiva, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha zeh klal gadol b'Torah." Love your neighbor is a great principle of Torah. So I once heard from one of my teachers the question, how could there be an inconsistency of such great magnitude between that statement? Rabbi Akiva said that v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is the most important value, and then you have all of his students who the Gemara says died because lo no'agu kavod ze said they didn't treat each other with respect, whatever that means, and that's not a contradiction to how they died, but just the context of whatever in hindsight chait that Chazal were identifying. So one of my teachers, and I forget where I heard this from because I've heard it for so many years, made the suggestion that when Rabbi Akiva rebuilt his Beis Medrash from his 5 students, he rebuilt it on a new philosophy. That sometimes you have to learn from the past and change your approach. So if his approach prior to that moment might have been a different one, we don't know, because we don't know what his Beis Medrash was like. But we do know what Rabbi Akiva lived by subsequently. And the legacy of Rabbi Akiva's lessons that were taught by his students, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, etc., was to build a Beis Medrash based on V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So that even that piece of the story was part of what Rabbi Akiva could retool and rebuild and re-engage in moving forward. So I think that's also part of the lesson.
Regarding the Abarbanel, that they first ate and then conducted Sipur, that already appears in the Mordechai at the end of Psachim.
Many say it. I just found it easy to quote, but it's a sort of a classic answer to that question.
Right. Rav Mordechai Breuer develops that in his article on Heker Latinokot.
Right.
Sure.
Okay, we will adjourn
Thank
here.
you very much.
Thank you.
Chag Kasher v'Sameach.
The same to you.
Thank you.
Same to you.